6,000 volts are humming through the salt-soaked mud. Thousands watch in a silence so heavy it suffocates. A titan of the wild is about to be sacrificed, not for science, but for a patent. Thomas Edison is holding the switch, and the smell of ozone is about to become the scent of murder. The late 19th century arrived not as a herald of enlightenment but as a thick, suffocating blanket of soot and industrial greed that settled over the gasping lungs of the modern world. In the crowded corridors of New York, the air was a viscous soup of horse manure, coal smoke, and the metallic tang of blood from the slaughterhouses that fed the city's insatiable hunger. This was an era where human life was weighed on the same scales as scrap iron, a period of transition where the old gods of muscle and steam were being ruthlessly usurped by a new, invisible master. The city itself resembled a massive, unwashed organism, its streets clogged with the refuse of progress and the broken bodies of those who dared to dream of a better life in the shadow of the rising tenements. High above the drowning masses of the Bowery, a new skeletal architecture began to take shape, a chaotic web of copper and lead that promised to banish the night forever. These wires did not represent a connection between souls, but rather a strangulating noose tightening around the neck of the old world. Civilization was no longer a philosophical ideal, it had become a biological infection, a sprawling cancer whose metastases were these very lines of power stretching into every dark corner of the urban landscape. Every inch of wire laid was a claim staked by a new breed of predator, men who viewed the elementary forces of the universe as private property to be hoarded and sold to the highest bidder. At the epicenter of this burgeoning web sat a figure whom the history books would later sanitize into a benevolent grandfather of invention, a secular saint of the workshop. To the contemporary eye, however, he was the ultimate overseer of a technological plantation, a man who viewed the world through the cold, unblinking lens of a balance sheet. He was not interested in the beauty of the spark, but in the efficiency with which that spark could be converted into coin. For this master of industry, the divide between light and darkness was not a moral one, but a binary of profit and loss, where every flickering bulb was a testament to his dominion over the natural order. The war for the soul of the electrical age was never a scholarly debate conducted in the hallowed halls of academia or the quietude of a laboratory. It was a visceral, street-level brawl fought with the same ferocity as a territorial dispute between rival gangs in the 5 Points. When his empire of direct current began to falter under the superior reach of a rival's alternating current, the inventor did not retreat into reflection or refine his equations. Instead, he reached for the most primal of human tools, fear. He understood that the masses could not be swayed by mathematics, but they could be easily manipulated by the spectacle of death and the primal dread of the unknown. In the laboratories of West Orange, science underwent a grotesque mutation, shedding its robes of inquiry to don the blood-stained apron of a butcher. The air in these facilities no longer smelled of ozone and discovery, but of singed hair and the sharp, nauseating stench of scorched flesh. It became a theater of the macabre where the boundaries between innovation and sadism were blurred beyond recognition. Here, the great minds of the age spent their hours not on the advancement of humanity, but on the meticulous refinement of execution, turning the tools of life into instruments of a very public and terrifying mortality. Stray dogs, plucked from the freezing gutters for a handful of copper cents, became the first unwilling martyrs of this corporate crusade. These animals, already hollowed out by hunger and the cruelty of the streets, were led into the flickering light of the testing rooms to serve as biological proxies for a terrified public. They were wired to the rival's alternating current, their small frames twitching in rhythmic agony as the invisible force surged through their veins. This was not research, it was a carefully choreographed campaign of terror, designed to prove that the rival's progress was nothing more than a silent, lurking executioner waiting to strike in every home. The inventor watched these displays with a clinical detachment that bordered on the pathological, his eyes reflecting the blue flash of the dying beasts. For him, a dog's life was merely a unit of measurement, a disposable vessel used to demonstrate the lethality of a competitor's product. He was the architect of a new kind of marketing, one that required a steady supply of corpses to sustain its narrative. The public, always hungry for the sensational, flocked to these demonstrations, their horror mingled with a morbid fascination that the inventor was all too happy to exploit for the sake of his patents. As the months turned into years, the scale of these sacrifices began to grow, reflecting the increasing desperation of a man losing his grip on the future. The transition from the small, shivering bodies of curs to the heavy, muscular frames of horses signaled a darkening of the industrial soul. These noble animals, who had hauled the city's burdens until their hearts burst, were now recycled into props for a lethal circus. Each execution was documented with the cold precision of a ledger entry, a testimony to a world where the sanctity of life had been entirely superseded by the demands of the market and the ego of the powerful. The city continued to swell, oblivious to the blood that greased the gears of its new illumination, as the copper veins pulsed with a power that few truly understood. The streets remained a battlefield of filth and survival, but now they were lit by a glow that carried the faint, lingering scent of the laboratory's furnace. The immigrant workers, the orphans, and the broken-down laborers were the fuel that kept the machine running, their own lives as precarious as the animals being sacrificed in the name of progress. They were the silent witnesses to an era where the brilliance of the light was directly proportional to the darkness of the deeds required to maintain it. This was the true face of the American dream at the turn of the century, a landscape of shimmering wires and rotting tenements, where the genius of the age was measured by his ability to kill in the most efficient manner possible. The inventor had successfully transformed the mystery of the cosmos into a commodity, and in doing so, he had set the stage for a final, monstrous act of public violence. The shadows of the 19th century were fading, but they were being replaced by a glare so harsh and unforgiving that it threatened to strip away the last vestiges of human empathy, leaving only the cold, hard logic of the machine behind. The laboratory at West Orange did not resemble a cradle of innovation so much as it mirrored a sophisticated abattoir where the primary product was terror. Within these brick walls, the air was perpetually stagnant, heavy with the metallic scent of copper and the underlying, sweet rot of the surrounding marshes. It was here that the great mind of the age decided that the most effective way to protect a monopoly was not through the refinement of a filament, but through the public dismantling of life itself. The war between direct and alternating current had long since abandoned the dignified realms of mathematics and entered the visceral territory of the butcher's block. Every shadow in the corner of the workshop seemed to pulse with a predatory intent, waiting for the next victim to be ushered into the flickering light of a lethal demonstration. The inventor moved through these spaces with the cold, measured gait of an actuary calculating the value of a soul against the cost of a patent. To him, the natural world was not a wonder to be preserved, but a vast reservoir of biological machinery that could be dissected and discarded in the pursuit of a cleaner balance sheet. His face, often described by fawning journalists as the visage of a sage, was in private a mask of grim determination, lined with the anxieties of a man who saw his kingdom being eroded by a superior technology. The direct current empire was hemorrhaging gold, and the only way to stem the flow was to paint the rival's alternating current as an invisible, omnipresent executioner. He would transform the very essence of the new age into a ghost story that would haunt the dreams of every household in America. The raw material for this propaganda campaign was gathered from the lowest strata of urban existence, where survival was a daily gamble against hunger and disease. In the gutters of Manhattan and the docks of Jersey City, ragged boys were paid 25 cents for every stray dog they could snatch from the filth. These animals were the discarded refuse of a booming population, creatures that had learned to dodge the wheels of hansoms and the kicks of drunken sailors, only to be led into a trap by the promise of a scrap of meat. They were the perfect subjects for the inventor's experiments because their deaths carried no political consequence and required no paperwork beyond a simple tally in a ledger. To the men in the laboratory, a dog was simply a collection of nerves and muscles that could be made to dance for the sake of a terrifying narrative. The executions were conducted with a clinical efficiency that stripped the act of killing of any lingering remnants of ritual or mercy. The animals were led into a designated area where the floor was often slick with the condensation of 100 terrified breaths and the spilled oil of the heavy machinery. Their paws were lashed to metal plates with coarse twine, the rough fibers cutting into their skin as they whimpered in confusion and instinctive dread. There was no grandeur in these moments, only the mundane sounds of buckles being tightened and the low, ominous hum of the generators beginning to spin. The assistants, hardened by months of this repetitive carnage, moved with a mechanical precision, their hands steady as they prepared to unleash the force that would turn a living creature into a heap of useless protein. When the switch was finally thrown, the transformation was instantaneous and horrific, a violent rupture of the biological order. The alternating current did not simply stop the heart, it turned the body against itself, forcing every muscle into a catastrophic, bone-shaking contraction that defied the laws of anatomy. The sound was not a scream, but a wet, rhythmic thudding of a frame hitting the floor, accompanied by the high-pitched whistle of air being forced through a constricted throat. Within seconds, the smell would arrive, a thick and suffocating cloud of ozone mixed with the stench of singed hair and the acrid aroma of scorched flesh. It was the scent of the future, a fragrance of industrial dominance that lingered in the nostrils of the observers long after the body had grown cold and still. The inventor stood by, his notebook open, recording the duration of the agony with the same detachment he might use to track the evaporation of a chemical solvent. He noted the exact voltage required to burst the capillaries in a canine's eyes, turning them into twin orbs of clouded crimson before the life finally flickered out. To him, these were not deaths but data points, necessary sacrifices to ensure that the public associated the rival's current with the smell of a burning kennel. He was not interested in the suffering of the individual animal, but in the aggregate effect of their deaths on the stock market and the collective psyche of a nation. The laboratory had become a temple of corporate nihilism, where the only sacred truth was the preservation of a market share at any human or animal cost. As the campaign progressed, the inventor realized that the deaths of small scavengers were not enough to sustain the momentum of fear he required. The public was becoming desensitized to the image of a dying dog, and so the scale of the atrocities had to be increased to maintain their impact. He turned his attention to the horses, the silent, suffering engines of 19th-century commerce that had literally built the city on their backs. These were noble creatures, their joints swollen from years of hauling coal and ice through the frozen slush of the winters, their eyes weary with the resignation of a lifetime of labor. They were brought to the laboratory when they were no longer useful to their masters, sold for their weight in hide and bone to be used in one last, grisly service for the advancement of the inventor's career. The execution of a horse was a logistical challenge that required more elaborate machinery and a greater degree of cold-blooded planning. The animal would be led into a reinforced stall, its massive chest heaving with the exertion of the walk and the primal scent of nearby death that no amount of cleaning could ever fully erase. The metallic plates were larger now, the wires thicker, resembling the heavy chains of a dungeon rather than the components of a scientific inquiry. When the current surged through the animal's massive frame, the result was a spectacle of raw, unadulterated violence that made the previous experiments seem like child's play. The horse's legs would lock into rigid, unyielding pillars, and the sound of its internal organs failing was like the tearing of wet canvas in a storm. In those moments, the laboratory was filled with a heat that felt oily and invasive, a byproduct of the massive resistance offered by the animal's flesh to the encroaching power. The assistants often had to turn their faces away as the steam rose from the horse's flanks, a ghostly manifestation of the life being boiled out of its very cells. The inventor, however, never blinked, his eyes fixed on the stopwatch as he calculated the efficiency of the kill. He was teaching the world a lesson in the language of the slaughterhouse, ensuring that the name of his rival was forever linked to this brutal, high-voltage butchery. The horse would eventually collapse, a mountain of meat and matted hair, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the noise of the machinery. Outside the walls of the laboratory, the city of New York continued its frantic, dirty expansion, oblivious to the fact that its new illumination was being baptized in the blood of the innocent. The newspapers, fueled by the inventor's carefully leaked reports, began to run headlines that screamed of the invisible death lurking in the wires of the alternating current. Mothers were warned that the very lamps meant to light their children's nurseries were potential lightning bolts waiting to strike, a domestic terror campaign orchestrated by a man who styled himself as a protector of the home. The irony was as thick as the coal smoke over the Hudson. The man who claimed to bring light to the world was using the deepest shadows of human cruelty to maintain his grip on the switch. This was the true nature of the industrial spirit, a cold and calculating force that viewed the world as a collection of resources to be exploited until they were hollowed out. The inventor was not an anomaly, he was the ultimate expression of his era, a man who understood that in the grand theater of capitalism, the most successful performance is the one that leaves the audience too frightened to look anywhere else. The bodies of the dogs and horses were piled into wagons and hauled away under the cover of night, their bones destined for the glue factories and their hides for the tanneries, while their deaths remained etched into the blueprints of the electrical grid. The war of currents was being won not by the best light, but by the most efficient darkness. The air in West Orange remained thick with the ghosts of these experiments, a lingering miasma of industrial sin that no amount of success could ever wash away. The inventor continued his work, his hands stained with the invisible ink of 1,000 casualties, as he prepared for the next phase of his campaign. He knew that to truly cement his legacy, he would need a victim whose death would be so monumental, so undeniable, that it would silence his critics forever. The era of small sacrifices was ending, and the age of the public execution was about to reach its grotesque zenith. The world was about to learn that when science is guided by the hand of a monopolist, the result is never enlightenment, only a more brightly lit chamber of horrors. By the dawn of 1903, the predatory appetite of industrial propaganda had grown too massive to be sated by the casual slaughter of stray curs and broken-down carriage horses. The public, that vast and fickle beast nurtured on a diet of sensationalist tabloids and public hangings, had developed a dangerous immunity to the smaller horrors of the West Orange laboratories. Fear, the most potent currency in the inventor's ledger, was devaluing at an alarming rate, and the monopoly of direct current was hemorrhaging relevance as the superior alternating current continued to illuminate the burgeoning skyscrapers of the Gilded Age. The great mind behind the incandescent bulb realized that to maintain his grip on the nation's throat, he needed a spectacle of such monumental cruelty that it would be etched into the collective memory of the century. He required a victim that embodied the very majesty of the wild, a creature whose public annihilation would serve as a final, crushing argument for his corporate dominance. The stage for this technological crucifixion was not a dignified hall of science, but the tawdry, salt-stained grounds of Menlo Park on Coney Island. By January of 1903, this playground of the masses had become a surreal landscape of peeling paint, rusted iron, and the pervasive, cloying scent of fried dough and animal misery. Under the gray, unforgiving sky of a New York winter, the park was a skeletal husk of its summer self, a place where the illusion of joy was stripped away to reveal the cold, mechanical greed beneath. Here, amidst the shuttered carousels and the frozen mud of the Atlantic shore, the final act of a long and bloody marketing campaign was being meticulously choreographed. The air was thick with the tang of the ocean, but it could not mask the metallic odor of the copper cables that were being snaked through the slush like the tentacles of a deep-sea predator. The victim of this corporate ritual was Topsy, a female Asian elephant whose life had been a long, agonizing descent through the various circles of human exploitation. For 28 years, she had been a captive laborer, a biological machine forced to perform for the amusement of crowds who viewed her through the lens of colonial arrogance. Her skin, once a supple shield against the suns of her ancestral lands, had become a cracked and calloused landscape of gray leather, scarred by the hooks and chains of a dozen different handlers. Topsy was not a creature to her owners, she was a depreciating asset, a stubborn piece of property that had begun to malfunction under the weight of decades of systematic abuse and the crushing loneliness of a concrete stall. She moved with a slow, rhythmic sway that was less a dance than a funeral dirge for her own fading vitality. Topsy's descent into the status of a condemned criminal was accelerated by the very hands that claimed to care for her. In the eyes of a society obsessed with order and profit, her occasional outbursts of rebellion were not seen as the desperate cries of a tortured soul, but as acts of premeditated murder. The most infamous incident occurred when a drunken handler, a man whose own life was a testament to the brutalizing effects of the era, attempted to feed Topsy a lit cigarette while poking her sensitive trunk with a pitchfork. In a singular moment of biological honesty, the elephant retaliated, crushing the life out of her tormentor with a single, massive foot. This act of self-defense was immediately branded as a crime against the social order, and the press began to describe her as a man-killer, a rogue beast that had no place in the bright, electrified future being built by men of progress. To the owners of Menlo Park, an elephant that killed its handlers was an economic liability that could no longer be insured or exhibited with safety. To Thomas Edison, however, she was a gift from the gods of commerce, a perfect vessel for his final, lethal demonstration. He saw in Topsy an opportunity to show the world that alternating current was not just a competitor, but a force of nature so violent that it could fell a giant in an instant. The plan was not to merely euthanize the animal, but to turn her death into a cinematic event, a high-voltage snuff film that would be distributed to every Nickelodeon in the country. The inventor's representatives descended upon Coney Island with the cold, methodical precision of undertakers, transforming a corner of the amusement park into an open-air execution chamber where science would play the role of the ultimate judge and jury. The preparations for the execution were conducted with a gruesome attention to detail that bordered on the fetishistic. Engineers and laborers, their faces obscured by the steam of their own breath in the freezing January air, worked to rig the site with enough electrical power to light a small city. They did not just bring wires, they brought a complex apparatus designed to ensure the maximum conductivity of the animal's massive body. Topsy was fitted with specially crafted copper sandals, a mocking parody of human footwear that would serve as the points of entry for the lethal surge. To further guarantee the efficiency of the kill, the ground beneath her was saturated with a thick, briny solution of salt water, turning the very earth she stood upon into a conduit for her destruction. Every bolt tightened and every cable laid was a calculated step toward a moment of perfect, engineered agony. As the day of the execution approached, the atmosphere around Coney Island took on a feverish, carnivalesque quality. Thousands of onlookers, many of whom had traveled from the city in the biting cold, gathered to witness the fall of the Titan. They were a microcosm of the new century, factory workers in threadbare coats, middle-class families seeking a morbid thrill, and journalists with their notebooks poised to record every twitch of the dying beast. There was no sense of tragedy among the crowd, only a pervasive, hungry anticipation for the spectacle of violence. The people were the byproduct of an era that had commodified everything, including death, and they stood in the mud with their eyes fixed on the center of the arena, waiting for the invisible lightning to strike. Inside her temporary enclosure, Topsy waited in a state of dull, heavy exhaustion, her trunk tracing the lines of the cold iron chains that bound her. She could smell the brine and the ozone, the sharp, unnatural sense that triggered a primal alarm in the recesses of her brain. Her world had shrunk to the length of a chain and the weight of the copper plates strapped to her feet. She was no longer a symbol of the wild, but a captured ghost, a remnant of an older world being prepared for burial by the architects of the new. The handlers who led her toward the execution spot did so with a mixture of fear and professional indifference, their sticks and prods a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. She walked with a dignity that the men around her could never possess, each step a heavy thud against the frozen, salt-soaked ground. The inventor himself remained a distant, presiding deity over the proceedings, his influence felt in the presence of the cameras that were being positioned to capture the event from multiple angles. This was to be the first filmed execution of its kind, a marriage of the new media and the new power that would define the coming century. The cameras were the eyes of a heartless future, recording the mechanics of death with a clinical lack of empathy. They would capture the exact moment when the soul was jarred from the body by a force it could not understand, preserving the image of Topsy's suffering as a permanent piece of corporate propaganda. The film was the ultimate patent, a visual proof of the inventor's reach that could be replicated and sold 10,000 times over. The final minutes before the current was unleashed were filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the distant crashing of the Atlantic waves against the boardwalk. The air seemed to vibrate with a static charge, a precursor to the violence that was about to occur. Topsy was led to the center of the saturated ground, her massive frame casting a long, distorted shadow across the mud. The copper sandals were connected to the heavy lead cables that trailed back to the generators like umbilical cords of fire. There was no priest to offer a final word, no moment of silence for the 28 years of servitude she had endured. There was only the sound of a heavy switch being gripped by a gloved hand, and the low, predatory hum of the machinery as it prepared to vomit forth its lethal cargo. In that frozen moment of 1903, the industrial age reached its spiritual nadir. The execution of Topsy was the ultimate expression of a philosophy that viewed life as a hurdle to be overcome and the natural world as a corpse to be looted. The mud, the salt, the copper, and the flesh were all components in a grand, cynical experiment designed to prove that the only true god of the new era was the one who controlled the flow of electrons. As the engineers checked their gauges for the final time, the crowd held its collective breath, their faces illuminated by the gray, wintry light of a world that had forgotten how to weep for anything that did not have a price tag. The transition from the era of the muscle to the era of the wire was about to be completed in a burst of artificial lightning that would leave the taste of scorched earth in the mouth of the 20th century. The dawn of January 4, 1903, broke over the Atlantic with the color of a bruised lung. A biting wind whipped across the gray expanse of the ocean, carrying the salt and the rot of the titterline deep into the marrow of the thousands who had gathered on Coney Island. They stood in the slush, a shivering congregation of the curious and the cruel, their boots sinking into a mire of frozen horse manure and discarded oyster shells. There was no sanctity in this gathering, only the heavy, expectant silence of a crowd waiting for a high-voltage miracle to justify their own miserable existence in the shadow of the machine. Menlo Park, in its winter hibernation, looked like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast, its white towers peeling in gray against the leaden sky. The festive illusions of the summer had been stripped away, leaving only the rusted iron, the splintered wood, and the cold, unyielding reality of a profit-driven enterprise. Beneath the shuttered stalls of the popcorn vendors and the silent tracks of the scenic railways, the mud was a graveyard of lost things, coins, buttons, and the forgotten hopes of the poor. This was the altar where the 20th century would offer its first great animal sacrifice, a site chosen for its accessibility to the press and its proximity to the pulsing heart of the city's power. Topsy was led to the center of this industrial arena with the slow, rhythmic gait of a creature that had already accepted its status as a ghost. Her massive frame was a map of 28 years of human disappointment, covered in the dust of 1,000 circus tents and the scars of 1,000 hooks. She did not struggle against the iron chains that bound her legs, she simply existed, a mountain of gray flesh and ancient memory being maneuvered into position by men with watches and clipboards. In the eyes of the onlookers, she was no longer a living thing, but a biological obsolescence, a heavy, breathing antiquity that the new world could no longer find a use for. The ground beneath her feet was a toxic cocktail of slush, brine, and the waste of the city, a slurry carefully prepared to ensure that the current would find no resistance in its path. Laborers had spent the morning drenching the earth with salt water, turning the very soil of the island into an extension of the generator's lethal circuit. This was the dark alchemy of the industrial age, where the elements of nature were weaponized against life itself in the name of corporate efficiency. Every square inch of the execution site was a calculated death trap, a masterpiece of engineering designed to turn a majestic animal into a grounded conduit for a businessman's ambition. A thick hempen noose was draped around Topsy's neck, a redundant cruelty added to ensure that if the lightning failed, the suffocating grip of the old world would finish the task. It was a bizarre juxtaposition of technologies, the ancient rope of the gallows meeting the invisible fire of the future, symbolizing a civilization that was still refining its methods of killing. The rope bit into the folds of her thick skin, a coarse and abrasive reminder that her life was now a matter of public record and private profit. To the engineers standing on the periphery, the noose was merely a safety measure, a backup system in the grand ledger of the morning's grim accounts. At her feet, the copper sandals were clamped onto her massive ankles with a finality that echoed the closing of a vault. These were not garments of protection, but the entry points for 6,000 volts of alternating current, the very energy that the inventor claimed would turn every home into a death trap. The copper gleamed with a dull, predatory light, contrasting sharply with the wet, dark leather of her hide. They were the physical manifestation of a contract signed in blood, connecting the biological machine of the elephant to the mechanical heart of the power station several miles away. The wires snaked through the mud like copper vipers, waiting for the signal to strike. The crowd watched with a voyeurism that was almost erotic in its intensity, their faces a sea of pale, hungry masks reflecting the gray light of the afternoon. There were no prayers offered, no words of apology spoken to the beast that had served their amusement for nearly 3 decades. Instead, the air was filled with the scent of cheap tobacco, the metallic tang of the nearby ocean, and the heavy, humid breath of thousands of people packed into a small, muddy space. They were there to see the moment where the invisible became visible, where the power of the new god would manifest as a physical rupture in the fabric of the living world. When the signal was finally given, there was a momentary hitch in the heartbeat of the world, a silence so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. The engineers at the controls moved with a mechanical indifference, their hands gripping the heavy iron levers that would bridge the gap between life and nothingness. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, only the cold, clinical application of a physical law to a sentient being. The switch was thrown, and in an instant, the 6,000 volts surged through the copper, the salt, and the flesh, claiming the giant as its own. Topsy's body did not simply collapse, it was seized by a convulsion so violent it seemed to defy the very gravity that held her to the earth. Every muscle in her 10,000-pound frame contracted simultaneously, a catastrophic firing of the nervous system that turned her hide into a rigid, vibrating shell. Her trunk curled inward in a silent, agonizing spiral, and her eyes rolled back into her head, white and sightless in the glare of the winter sun. The ground beneath her seemed to groan as the massive weight of her body was rattled by the invisible fire, a rhythmic, bone-shaking vibration that sent ripples through the nearby slush. Within seconds, the first wisps of smoke began to curl away from her feet, rising from the points where the copper sandals bit into the flesh. It was a thick, bluish vapor that smelled of the laboratory and the slaughterhouse, a chemical signal that the biological barrier had been breached. The heat generated by the resistance of her massive body was so intense that the moisture in her skin began to boil, turning the elephant into a living steam engine of her own destruction. The smoke rose in a column, caught by the Atlantic wind and dispersed over the heads of the crowd, who breathed in the vaporized remains of the animal they had come to see die. The smell was an assault on the senses, a complex and nauseating bouquet of industrial sin and biological decay. It was the sharp, metallic sting of ozone mixed with the heavy, cloying scent of roasted meat and the acrid stench of burning hair. This was the true perfume of progress, the scent of a world that had learned how to cook the soul out of the body for the sake of a headline. People in the front rows covered their mouths with their handkerchiefs, their faces turning a sickly shade of green as the reality of the spectacle finally pierced the veil of their curiosity. It was a smell that would haunt the boardwalk for days, a lingering reminder of the cost of the light. 10 seconds passed, though to the witnesses it felt like an eternity carved out of the very fabric of time. The current continued to pulse through her, a relentless, invisible hammer beating against the foundations of her life until there was nothing left but a smoldering husk. The hum of the generators was the only eulogy she received, a monotonous, industrial chant that celebrated the triumph of the wire over the bone. When the current was finally cut, the sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been, a vacuum of sound that swallowed the gasps of the onlookers. Topsy remained standing for a heartbeat longer, a monument of charred flesh, before the laws of physics finally reclaimed her. She fell not with a crash, but with a heavy, wet thud that sent a spray of salt-soaked mud into the air. The impact was felt in the soles of the spectators' boots, a subterranean shudder that marked the end of an era and the beginning of a nightmare. She lay on her side in the filth, her massive chest no longer heaving, her trunk resting in the mire like a discarded piece of industrial piping. The transition was complete, the mankiller was gone, replaced by a mountain of waste that would take days to dismantle and cart away to the rendering plants. The show was over, and the commerce of the new century could now proceed without the inconvenient presence of the old. As the crowd began to disperse, drifting away into the gray afternoon toward the ferry and the train, they carried the experience with them like a parasitic infection. They had seen the power of the inventor, and they had felt the cold breath of the machine on their own necks. The marketing of death had been a success, the fear of the rival's current was now a physical memory, tied to the image of the smoking elephant in the mud of Coney Island. The genius of the laboratories had won another battle in the war of currents, not through logic or superior design, but through the primal authority of the public execution. The light that would soon fill their homes was forever stained by the darkness of the January slush. The handlers and engineers began to pack their tools, moving among the cooling remains of Topsy with the practiced indifference of garbage men. The copper sandals were removed, the wires coiled, and the salt water allowed to drain away into the thirsty, indifferent sand. There was no ceremony for the disposal of the body, only the logistical problem of how to move several tons of dead animal before the tide came in. The island was returning to its winter silence, but the air remained heavy with the ghost of the ozone and the lingering, oily scent of the flesh. Progress had moved on, leaving only the mud and the memory of a giant who had been sacrificed to prove a point about a patent. The 10 seconds of artificial lightning had concluded, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of the gathered witnesses. Topsy, the titan of the circus, had surrendered to the invisible fire, her massive frame collapsing into the salt-soaked mire with the finality of a falling cathedral. In that singular moment of impact, she ceased to be a sentient being with memories of distant jungles and became merely a heap of dead protein, bone, and scorched leather. The transition was absolute and clinical, a biological machine reaching its scheduled termination under the guidance of a copper-wired god. The steam continued to rise from her cooling flanks, a ghostly exhalation of a life that had been traded for the preservation of a corporate monopoly. The inventor did not approach the fallen giant with anything resembling remorse or even the curiosity of a naturalist. He viewed the carcass with the satisfied gaze of a general surveying a conquered territory. For him, Topsy was not a casualty of science, but a successful data point in a campaign of calculated psychological warfare. The massive body lying in the mud was the ultimate evidence in a trial where the jury was the entire American public and the verdict was written in the ink of dividend checks. The War of the Currents had found its most potent weapon not in the laboratory's quietude, but in the loud, stinking theater of a public execution. Every smoldering inch of the elephant's hide was a testament to the length a man would go to protect his name from the encroaching shadows of obsolescence. The true innovation of the day, however, was not the death itself, but the presence of the unblinking eye that had witnessed every spasm and every plume of blue smoke. The kinetograph, that box of gears and celluloid, had swallowed the agony of the animal and transformed it into a repeatable, sellable commodity. This was the birth of a new and terrifying era, the age of the media-driven execution, where death was no longer a private end but a public entertainment that could be projected on a screen for a nickel. The inventor had realized that while a few thousand people stood in the cold of Coney Island, millions more could be reached through the flickering shadows of the film. The pain of a living creature was now a piece of industrial property, a visual asset to be distributed through the burgeoning network of Nickelodeons. This was the final mutation of the scientific genius into the cynical showman, a man who understood that in a world of growing noise, only the most violent spectacles could cut through the apathy of the masses. He was no longer just illuminating rooms, he was colonizing the imagination of the public, using the trauma of the execution to build a psychological wall around his business interests. The film, titled with the cold pragmatism of a morgue entry as electrocuting an elephant, would serve as a silent, flickering warning to any household considering the switch to alternating current. It was a marketing strategy built on the foundation of a snuff film, a marriage of technology and cruelty that would set the tone for the coming century of mass-marketed fear. As the technicians began to disconnect the heavy lead cables from the copper sandals, the air remained saturated with the nauseating perfume of the event. The smell was a thick, oily miasma that clung to the wool coats of the reporters and the greasy aprons of the park laborers alike. It was the scent of scorched muscle and the sharp, metallic sting of ozone, a fragrance of progress that bypassed the reason and struck directly at the primal centers of the brain. The salt water that had served as a conduit now ran dark with the fluids of the deceased, soaking back into the sand of the island like a libation to a god of machines. There was no dignity in the cleanup, only the logistical necessity of dismembering a mountain of flesh before the winter sun dipped below the horizon. The crowd began to flow out of the park, a slow, dark tide of humanity moving toward the train stations and the ferry docks, their faces pale in the fading light. They carried the memory of the thud and the smoke within them, a silent infection of horror that they would eventually domesticate into a story for the dinner table. They were the first consumers of the new death, participants in a ritual that replaced the sacred with the commercial and the empathetic with the voyeuristic. Behind them, the skeleton of the park stood as a silent witness to the transaction that had just occurred, where a living spirit was ground down into the silver halides of a film strip for the sake of a patent war. Back in the development labs, the celluloid was being bathed in chemicals, the silver reacting to the recorded light to freeze Topsy's final moments into a permanent record of corporate triumph. The flickering images showed the sudden jerk of the legs and the slow, agonizing descent, a mechanical ballet of mortality that would be repeated thousands of times across the country. Each time the film ran, the elephant died again, her suffering recycled to generate a profit and to reinforce the authority of the men who held the switch. The inventor's signature was now written in the smoke of the execution, a brand that claimed ownership over the very nature of electricity and its place in the modern home. The economic reality of the scene was as stark as the winter sky. The execution was a calculated investment with a clearly defined return. Every dog, horse, and elephant that had perished under the inventor's hand was a line item in a ledger of dominance, a cost of doing business in a world where empathy was a liability. The safety of the public was the hollow justification, a mask worn to hide the predatory features of a man who would rather burn a giant alive than lose a percentage of the market. The bills that would arrive in the mailboxes of the city were not just payments for light, they were tithes to an empire that had been built on the charred remains of anything that dared to stand in its path. As the night descended over Coney Island, the carcass of Topsy was left to the butchers, who would carve the animal into manageable pieces for the rendering plants and the glue factories. The magnificent beast was reduced to barrels of oil and piles of bone meal, a final indignity in a life defined by the cruelty of human hands. The mud where she fell would eventually be paved over, the salt washed away by the tides, and the memory of the smell buried under layers of newer, more modern distractions. But the precedent had been set. The world was now a place where the spectacle of death was a legitimate tool of the industry, and science was merely the handmaiden of the highest bidder. In the quiet of his study, the inventor could rest easy, knowing that the image of the dying elephant was now an indelible part of the national consciousness. He had successfully associated the superior technology of his rival with the stench of the abattoir, turning a scientific debate into a visceral nightmare. The monthly statements would continue to bear his name, and the wires of his empire would continue to strangle the cities, fueled by the fear he had so expertly manufactured. The light in the parlors of the wealthy might have been bright, but it was cast by a power that had first been demonstrated as a lethal, unthinking force of destruction. The transition from the 19th to the 20th century was not a leap of faith, but a slide into a more sophisticated form of barbarism. The execution of Topsy was the bridge between the old world of physical struggle and the new world of psychological control, where the camera and the wire worked in tandem to keep the population in awe. We are the descendants of those who watched the smoke rise on that January afternoon, living in a civilization that still measures its progress by the efficiency with which it can consume and discard the living. The inventor's true legacy was not the bulb, but the understanding that in the kingdom of the machine, the only thing more valuable than life is the ability to end it on camera for a profit. The tides of the Atlantic returned to wash the salt-soaked mud of Coney Island as the winter of 1903 deepened, but the ocean could not scrub away the lingering psychic stain of the execution. As the final stragglers of the crowd vanished into the gray mists of the city, their faces pale and their collars turned up against the biting wind, a new set of laborers arrived to claim the center of the arena. These were not the engineers of the high-voltage age or the scientists of the laboratory, but the men of the rendering plants, the biological scavengers of the industrial machine. They carried heavy saws, iron hooks, and flaying knives, their canvas clothes already stiff with the dried blood and grease of 1,000 slaughtered cattle. For these men, the fallen giant was not a martyr for science or a victim of a corporate war. She was merely 10,000 pounds of cooling, industrial-grade cargo that needed to be processed before the rot of the sea air set in. The industrial machine, having successfully used the elephant's final agony as a piece of lethal propaganda, now prepared to consume her physical remains with the same efficient, unblinking greed. Topsy was dismantled piece by piece in the flickering, smoky light of oil lanterns, her massive organs pulled from the cavity of her chest and tossed into waiting wagons like sacks of wet, heavy coal. Her fat would be boiled down in massive iron vats to make soap for the very people who had watched her die, and her bones would be ground into a fine dust to serve as fertilizer for the expanding farmlands of a continent being hollowed out by progress. This was the ultimate circular economy of the late 19th century, a world where nothing was wasted, not even the dignity of the dead or the memory of a captive's suffering. The transition from a living being to a set of industrial components was a masterpiece of cold, calculating logistics that mirrored the inventor's own heart, a final act of desecration in a life defined by human chains. In the days following the slaughter on the boardwalk, the film of Topsy's death began its slow, parasitic crawl through the dark Nickelodeons of the nation, bringing the smell of the abattoir into the heart of the American parlor. In cramped, windowless rooms that smelled of stale sweat, cheap tobacco, and the unwashed bodies of the urban poor, the masses paid their copper cents to witness the high-voltage murder on repeat. They sat in the shadows, their eyes glazed with the same voyeuristic hunger that had fueled the crowd on the Atlantic shore, watching the silver-gray flickering of the elephant's final convulsion as the celluloid spun through the projector. This was the new religion of the industrial age, where the sacred mystery of life's end was stripped of its gravity and transformed into a cheap, repeatable thrill for the entertainment of the bored and the broken. The inventor had correctly understood that the modern soul was not seeking enlightenment or mercy, but a visceral distraction from its own creeping sense of insignificance in the face of the massive, energized machine. The War of the Currents did not conclude with a handshake between rivals or a dignified debate in a hall of science. It ended with the quiet, institutionalized adoption of a new method of state-sponsored killing. The experiments on the grounds of West Orange, which had begun with the casual electrocution of stray curs and the systematic destruction of worn-out horses, found their logical and final conclusion in the design of the electric chair. This mahogany throne of the industrial age was the direct, hybrid descendant of the copper sandals Topsy had worn in the mud of the island, a refined instrument of death that used the rival's current to eliminate the unwanted elements of society. It was the ultimate bureaucratization of violence, a device that allowed the state to end a human life with the same clinical, domestic precision used to light a street lamp or power a sewing machine. The raw, bloody brutality of the frontier was not being extinguished as the 20th century dawned, it was merely being moved indoors, connected to the municipal power grid, and marketed as a more civilized form of justice. We are frequently told by the hagiographers of the age that the expansion of the electrical grid was a triumph of human ingenuity, a beacon of reason that finally banished the medieval darkness of the superstitious past. But this narrative conveniently ignores the fact that the copper wires were laid over a foundation of carcasses and that the light of the new world was fueled by the heat of burned flesh. The illumination that filled the homes of the emerging middle class was born from a culture of public slaughter, corporate intimidation, and a profound contempt for the living world. The inventor, now hailed as a national hero and a secular saint of the workshop, had successfully demonstrated that science was most effective when it functioned as an instrument of terror and social control. His legacy was not the abolition of the night, but the creation of a world where even the most fundamental forces of the universe were harnessed to the wagon of capital and used to crush anyone or anything that stood in the path of a patent. Civilization, in this cynical and realistic light, appears not as a gradual improvement of the human condition, but as a more sophisticated and pervasive form of domestication. The wildness of the American West had been broken not by the individual bravery of the pioneer or the grit of the explorer, but by the relentless, invisible reach of the wire, the rail, and the electric pulse. The elephant, the bison, and the indigenous populations of the plains were all treated as biological obstacles to be calculated, quantified, and eventually cleared away to make room for the cold infrastructure of the market. The copper lines were the new boundaries of the cage, a sprawling, continental enclosure that promised the illusion of safety while demanding an absolute and unthinking submission to the flow of the current. Those who lived within this web were no longer citizens of a free republic, but components in a massive, energized plantation where survival was tied to the ability to pay the monthly bill. The electric chair at Auburn Prison and the smoking ruins of Topsy's body in the Coney Island slush were two sides of the same debased coin of industrial progress. When the first human prisoner was subjected to the current in the name of a more humane form of execution, the process was a gruesome, sputtering failure, a biological butchery that left the witnesses in a state of physical shock and nausea. Yet, the inventor and his agents did not see this as a moral catastrophe or a reason to pause their crusade. They saw it as a technical hurdle to be cleared in the pursuit of a more perfect and efficient method of killing. They understood with a terrifying clarity that the public could be habituated to any horror as long as it was presented as a necessity of the modern age and a byproduct of scientific advancement. The scent of scorched flesh became the signature of a state that had finally achieved the power of the gods without inheriting even a single grain of their mercy. Every modern convenience we enjoy in our climate-controlled rooms is a thick, decorative layer of paint over a surface of profound and ancient rot. The refrigerators that hum in our kitchens and the glowing screens that illuminate our tired faces are powered by the same logic that demanded the public sacrifice of a captive elephant in 1903. We live in a world of high-voltage ghosts, where the memories of the victims are buried under the constant, white noise of the machinery and the relentless demands of the economy. The history of the 19th century is not a chronicle of heroes, but a long, bloody inventory of losses, a ledger where the lives of the many were traded for the comfort and the profit of the few. We are the inheritors of this darkness, even as we bask in the artificial glow of the wires that Topsy died to validate for the sake of a corporate balance sheet. The inventor himself lived long enough to see his myth fully solidified in the eyes of the world, his earlier cruelties smoothed over by the busy hands of fawning biographers and well-paid public relations experts. He became the wizard, a figure of wisdom and benevolence who had supposedly conquered the shadows for the sake of humanity's future. But in the deep, unlit corners of the laboratories at West Orange, the spirits of the dogs, the horses, and the elephant remained, a silent and accusatory presence that no amount of accolades could ever dispel. He was a man who had looked into the heart of the electric spark and saw only the glint of a copper coin, a visionary who understood that a frightened and entertained population is far easier to manage than one that possesses hope or empathy. His real invention was not the light, but the marketing of the lethal invisible, a fear that could be sold back to the people as a form of protection. The consumer's role in this dark history is one of quiet, subsidized complicity that stretches across the decades. Every time a switch is flipped in a modern house, we are participating in a system that was baptized in the blood of the innocent and forged in the heat of a marketing campaign that utilized the abattoir as its stage. The industrial era demanded a radical and permanent shift in human empathy, a narrowing of the gaze that allowed the individual to ignore the horrific cost of their own daily comfort. We have become experts at looking away from the rendering plant and the laboratory, focusing instead on the clean, white light of the glass bulb. But the smell of the ozone and the singed hair never truly left the air of the city. It is still there, lingering in the back of the throat, a persistent reminder that our civilization is a fragile and violent construct built upon a foundation of systematic and high-tech cruelty. If we look closely at the frosted glass of our modern existence, we can see the distorted outlines of the horrors that were required to forge the world we inhabit. The history of progress is not a ladder to the heavens, but a slow and methodical descent into a more efficient and clinical form of savagery. The elephant in the mud of Coney Island was a mirror held up to the soul of the coming century, and the reflection it showed was one of utter, terrifying indifference to the value of life. We have traded the unpredictable and wild dangers of the natural world for the predictable, high-voltage cruelty of the corporate machine. The cage is now complete, and the invisible electrons serve as the bars that keep us in our place, content to live in the glow while the memory of the ash and the blood fades into the gray, indifferent Atlantic mist. Ultimately, the story of Topsy and the inventor is the story of how the world was stolen from the living and given to the corporation in the name of a brighter future. It is a tale of how the majesty of the natural world was reduced to a unit of electrical resistance and a source of cheap, sensationalist entertainment for the urban masses. The dark side of the West was never about the lawlessness of the desert frontier, it was about the cold, legalistic, and scientific brutality of the urban center. The true wilderness was not found in the desert or on the plains, but in the boardrooms and the laboratories where men decided who would live and who would burn for the sake of a quarterly report. The light we have inherited is a cold fire, a brilliant and unfeeling illumination that reveals every detail of our surroundings while explaining nothing about the cost of the human soul. As we stand at the threshold of a new millennium, the ghosts of 1903 still walk the energized corridors of our collective power. The technology has changed, the wires have become wireless, and the spectacles of death have moved to the palms of our hands, but the underlying drive for dominion and profit remains entirely the same. We are still the audience standing in the freezing slush, waiting for the next catastrophe to justify our own existence and to distract us from the emptiness of our progress. The rot of the past is not behind us, It is the very soil from which our present grows, and the blood of the elephant is still wet on the hands of the machine. The frosted glass is beginning to crack, and the smell of the scorched flesh is rising once again, a final, cynical reminder that the price of the light has always been, and will always be, the lifeblood of the world we have sought to illuminate.